Hello, I kind of wanted to do maybe one more section for this Baudrillard section of videos that I've been doing lately, and I'm kind of really excited to finish the series off because then I get to kind of move on to talking about a different author, which I think will be nice and I think definitely refreshing. But in this particular video, I wanted to finish off now talking about Baudrillard on the AF and talk about how I think teams can better answer Baudrillard on the AF. I'll definitely do two videos that are kind of talking about specific different ways that you can use different types of arguments to answer Baudrillard, which your focal points are. But for this particular place, I wanted to talk about some of my thoughts on just like reading Baudrillard on the AF in general and ways that you can kind of apply some of the conversations that we've had earlier, because I think that seeing Baudrillard on the AF is something that's a little bit more common. I think people are a little bit more comfortable reading Baudrillard as an AF argument than a neck argument a lot of times, and I think at least in my experience, or what I've seen from coaching and teaching and from debating, like most of the times I think that being able to answer these AFs and understanding how they kind of want to operate and what makes them really strong is particularly important for like what type of strategy that you take up, because I think if you walk in without kind of like any background knowledge on what these apps are really trying to accomplish, it can be extremely hard to really create points of offense that are really contesting their ability to just kind of like centralize claims around like the thesis of their argument. And so I think both watching what I'll be doing in this video in terms of talking about how teams can better execute Baudrillard on the AF and seeing the talk that I'll kind of have talking about how teams can better answer Baudrillard can both be like really helpful regardless of what kind of angle you're coming from. But I definitely want to start in just talking about how I think Baudrillard can be better executed on the AF. I've seen this argument in a wide variety of ways, and I've seen it done a lot of ways. I think a lot of the times that the best type of arguments that I think Baudrillard authors really make in terms of various resolutions on the affirmative is both making an argument about like debate and making an argument about the way in which like the particular resolution functions as a kind of like mirror for how both debate and the war operate politically. So thinking about the ways in which for example, on the water topic, the way that we produce certain ideas about like what is like scarce, or like how resources are scarce, how much water is left, not left, and the ability for us to actually manage those resources, like all of these things are kind of ways in which the particular way in which we come to know and think about natural resources are kind of enfolded onto these like greater values that are produced in under Baudrillard's theories when you're thinking about signs, signifiers that we talked about in other places. And so I think that when you're reading this type of argument, you definitely want to start, especially on the case page, with just winning a kind of like centralized thesis that makes a connection between how debate kind of mirrors the types of critique that you want to make about the resolution to like a kind of like greater critique of like the world or the structure of black politics broadly. I think it's incredibly important when you're starting on the case page to really make a strong push on like maybe not why you're gonna win this debate based off of a real like impact comparison kind of value, but why if you're able to win and kind of control the way in which your thesis is operating and the way that it reflects a critique about the world, why that kind of controls the uniqueness and the way the judge should be framing other pages. I think Baudrillard apps are extremely strong when they just focus on being able to densely debate about the thesis of the affirmative and use that to kind of frame how they answer every single other argument, and being able to force every other argument to kind of be represented along the types of critique that they're making, the distinctions that they make between form and content, etc. And it kind of feels like that as long as you're kind of ahead on why your particular thesis of the world is true, then it could be extremely hard for a negative team to really beat you, because a lot of the other arguments that are kind of like best made out of this stretch out of that central thesis claim and touch like different flows very differently. And I think being able to just like really be in on like how your thesis claim is really able to touch these things, and the broader you're able to make it, and the more examples you're able to tag on to the types of arguments you're making, the better this argument will end up coming. So I think that, for instance, when you're trying to figure out how you should debate various criticisms, etc., when you're thinking about how you should debate various case arguments, you should always think about how you kind of find a middle ground between the way you're able to theorize your 1AC broadly and the way in which that theory is able to touch or consider the types of things that are being offered by the criticism, the type of population that is attempting to represent, the way in which it's trying to critique from a particular lens of performance, identity, location, or competing theory, etc. And I think that that is just the place where you usually want to start in terms of how you're figuring out the ways that you want to apply your offense to other places. Additionally, I think that the case page can be a really good place for you to figure out how you can really get into the nitty gritty of like what type of offense you're going to set up on other pages. I think that a lot of times negative teams really stick to reading generics about why Baudrillard is wrong, like just like broadly, and a lot of times they don't really touch in on specific methods that you may offer. And so I think that creatively, the more you get into being able to create a 1AC that's really specific and does something to kind of like think about an interpretation of Baudrillard that other teams aren't necessarily touching, the more nuance you can kind of bring out in how this argument pops, and the harder it is for for them to apply other arguments they want to make. Additionally, when I think you're debating against something like framework or topicality, the debate that you want to have on Baudrillard, I think, is really interesting. I think there are a lot of routes you could take it, and I think Baudrillard is one of the arguments where you definitely have the most creative options open in terms of like how you want to think about how you're answering framework and T. But I will always say that because of this limitless amount of options, it's also really easy to spread yourself too thin and not really create like a really focused story that allows you to dive deep into the parts of your aff that are the strongest and bring them to light in such a way that the judge is really understanding how your aff follows from the 1AC to the types of offense you really want to be isolating closer to the 2AR against something like framework and T. I think when you're doing something like this, the type of argument that you really want to make is that the way is first starting with your critique of how debate functions. A lot of the arguments that you're making about the connection between the resolution and debate are critiques that are meant to apply to the way in which framework is like being made, but I think you need to build those arguments around the language of like how you frame the value or non-value of debate, because making a value statement about like whether or not even the process that they're attempting to say that you are like violating is good or not gives you a kind of like framing question for how you want to like answer the rest of the flow. And I think most times it's like probably a lot better with these strategies to really commit to doing something a lot more offensive, because I think that the kind of like reasons for how you impact turn, the means in which other teams are trying to just assign productive value to debate is a place where I think Baudrillard arguments can be really strong as long as you have like good example work and you're doing a good job really being the team on how you're efficiently talking about the way in which top level theory like reaches into like explaining how their procedurals are framed and the impact to the judge. I think that when, for instance, if you're trying to figure out how you want to make your impact turns more prominent, I think the way that you should always start trying to figure out how you make your impact turns against framework more prominent is by starting with how you're questioning and thinking about like how you're framing the framework debate as a whole. What are the key questions that you're forcing the judge to consider and the ways that they evaluate your affirmative and the ways that you think about how that affirmative is able to consider what the process of debate means in like a larger kind of schematic. And I think that when you're kind of able to answer those questions for the judge, it can give them a lot easier lens to understand how you want them to evaluate your impacts and can really bridge a lot of the gaps I think that exist between like how judges are interpreting your arguments and the way in which like you're able to like produce them as ways that judges that are maybe outside of understanding Baudrillard or kind of outside of your ideological frame, how they would be able to weigh your type of arguments without, you know, falling into like traditional impact calculus, traditional norms of evaluating debate that you really want them to move away from. And so when you're doing that, I think it requires you to really bring a lot of the arguments from your aff and really carry them through and centralize maybe around one or two claims that you're creating a lot of offensive off of, instead of trying to create and spread yourself too thin with just being able to come up with various random points of offense from all different types of like where Baudrillard's theory comes from. Hopefully this first video was helpful in terms of getting you to understand how I think about Baudrillard on the app, and hopefully you'll see more to think about to see how I think about criticisms and counterpoints and disads. Thanks.